Mexico, who's here from Mexico City. You probably came the farthest to come, right? All right, thank you everybody for being here tonight. Welcome to our second session in this special lecture series at St. Cecilia Catholic Church, Whimsically Encountering Fathers of Mother Church, Ancient Voices, Modern Hearts. A month ago, in our adventure into the early church, we took our first steps into understanding who the church fathers are and why they matter for us as modern Catholics. I led us on an adventure from the start of St. Luke's Acts of the Apostles through the dawn of the golden age of the fathers of the church. We concluded our opening adventure with the Roman Emperor Constantine. Constantine, you will remember, or you'll be hearing newly now, was the first Christian emperor. Well, nominally Christian, anyway. He came to a special agreement in the year 313, a very important date to keep in our minds, our historical imaginations of the early church. A special agreement in 313 with his rival and co-emperor, the pagan Licinius, that is known as the Edict of Milan. With this gentleman's agreement, Christianity was made legal throughout the whole empire, ending over 2 decades of the most widespread and bloody of the intermittent persecutions against Christians that were propagated by pockets of Romans across the empire at different moments in the church's first 2.5 centuries of life. Through Constantine's long reign, he and his courts increasingly became intermingled with church affairs, to the point that in 325, that's another important year to have in our minds, in 325, the first ecumenical council of the church, the first council of Nicaea, was summoned not by a pope or a patriarch, but rather by the Emperor Constantine himself. The proximate theological cause for the council was the controversy throughout the church surrounding the teachings of the priest Arius. Arius will loom largely when we look at St. Athanasius of Alexandria in our next session, which after a hiatus for the Christmas season, we'll hold on January 22nd. That's what's on the sheets in front of you. For now, it is worth noting that tradition holds that some 318 bishops gathered at Nicaea ultimately voted in unison that God the Son is co-equally God with God the Father, and giving us the first draft of the creed that we recite every Sunday. The so-called Nicene Creed was revised with its lines about the Holy Spirit at the Second Ecumenical Council, the First Council of Constantinople in 381, and it has been recited in continuum since 381. It is unlikely that the Emperor Constantine, whose actual Christian commitment remains debated to this day, was particularly concerned about Arianism versus Nicene Trinitarianism. Rather, Constantine was concerned about religious unity. He viewed the formal unification of Christians around a central, imperially sanctioned creedal form as valuable for his endeavors to save the empire from the brink of inward collapse. If he could make the church uniform and peaceful, he surmised, then he could make the empire uniform and peaceful. This new phase of Christianity, the imperial phase, the phase of the legally structured institutional church during the last century or so of Roman imperial might, contains what is variously called the patristic golden age, or simply the great century, between roughly 310 and 430. Some of Christian history's most creative and intense luminaries studied, wrote, debated, and taught, including, but by no means limited to, Ambrose, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory the theologian, Basil the Great, and Ephraim the Syrian, whose potent poetry we will explore 2 sessions from now on February 26th. Debates about who God is, who Christ is, what a Christian must believe to be a Christian, how a Christian must live, how a Christian must pray, what liturgies ought to be like, and everything that one might imagine being a matter of contention among Christians came to matter on a public imperial scale. To enter into our lesson on Augustine today, then, our next lesson on Athanasius and our following lesson on Ephraim, we have to adopt the mindset that the theological debates in which these men participated occupied the social mind of their contexts more than this Minnesotan has discovered that American football occupies the Texan one. Aggies and Longhorns in 21st century Texas have nothing on Donatists and Catholics in St. Augustine's late 4th and early 5th century Roman North Africa. Curiously, we scholars of history know more about the life of Augustine of Hippo than we know about the life of any other individual person from the entire ancient world. After all, Augustine authored history's first comprehensive set of autobiographical remarks, the first ever, throughout his most widely read treatise, the Confessions. The Latin word confessio, which we carry into English as confession, means creed, avowal of faith, and praise. While in the Confessions, Augustine does confess many dark things about himself, the text is chiefly praise for God. This work, the Confessions, is wholly autobiographical, but it is not an autobiography, a self-life writing, as the etymology of that term suggests: autos, self, bios, life, graphos, writing. It is at least not an autobiography in the same way that we as moderns would expect. On Amazon.com, nearly every published autobiography is a self-aggrandizing hero narrative with only the aspects of the life of the subject that the subject wishes for the world to know. Augustine, however, is extremely hard on himself, and he is not even the main character of his own story. In the Confessions, the main character is God. The work is a 13-book set of lengthy, self-reflective prayers. History, theology, philosophy, prayer, meditation, apologetics, and remarkably modern-sounding psychology function together as one unit in this masterpiece of the patristic Golden Age. The Confessions is one of the best received works of all of Western Christian history. To this day, Catholics and Protestants alike consult it as a spiritual guide, and its influence on our Eastern Christian brethren is actively growing. Since St. Augustine is a doctor of the Church, we Roman Catholics consult his Confessions as a critical doctrinal guidebook. What do we believe? Well, one way that we can find that is just by reading this great story. In the Confessions, Augustine tells his life story in tremendous detail, framed as a philosopher's quest. That is, a quest for the absolute truth inside which he can take restful intellectual nourishment. He writes the Confessions in the first person and the second person, with the first person, I, being Augustine himself, and the second person, you, being God. This is the opening paragraph of Book 1 of Augustine's Confessions in the exquisite translation that was constructed by my great predecessor in the study of the Fathers of the Church named Henry Chadwick, whose book, The Early Church, I quoted last session. Listen to how Augustine interweaves the first person, I, and the second person, you, addressing God directly while interweaving many biblical phrases simultaneously in this thematic introduction to the entirety of his Confessions. Hear how he seamlessly quotes Psalm 47, Psalm 146, 2 Corinthians, and 1 Peter, all inside his own poetic prose. Quote, "You are great, Lord, and highly to be praised. Great is your power, and your wisdom is immeasurable. Man, a little piece of your creation, desires to praise you. A human being bearing his mortality with him, carrying with him the witness of his sin and the witness that you resist the proud. Nevertheless, to praise you is the desire of man, a little piece of your creation. You stir man to take pleasure in praising you, because you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." Even in the most attentive and informed translation, which the late professor and Anglican priest Henry Chadwick's certainly is, Augustine's refined writing, the fruit of his many years of advanced study and practice as a rhetorician at the highest levels, like being a professor of law at Harvard, is simply impossible to render well, or at least not perfectly. To give you a taste of what it sounds like, here is the same opening text of the Confessions in Augustine's original Latin. No, I do not expect you to hear the Latin as such. I just want you to hear the rhythm and how there's a certain timbre to how Augustine writes. "Magnus est, Domine, et laudabilis fomum. Mania virtus tua et sapientiae tuae non est nullus. Laudare te vultum, aliqua portio creaturae tuae. Et homo circumferens mortalitatem suam, circumferens testimonium peccati sui et testimonium. Quia superbis resistis, et tamen laudare te vultum, aliqua portio creaturae tuae. Tue scitas, ut laudare tu le deleca, quia fecisti nos a te, et inquietum est cor nostrum, done requiescat in te." Part of why I have just read the Latin aloud is to highlight that Augustine's first word in the Confessions is actually not Lord, nor is it even you, as Chadwick gives to us in order to make sensible English syntax. Rather, it is Magnus, great. Augustine knew Virgil's writings well, and it is often a part of classical poetry, like Virgil's, that the first word of a text is uniquely thematic for that text. We might recall for one of many examples of this phenomenon how the first Greek word of Homer's Odyssey is unra, about men, as in, about men to me do speak, O Muses. This is also how modern papal encyclicals and other central Vatican documents tend to work, with the first Latin word or words being revealingly thematic, and purposefully put there and ordered as they are to be revealingly thematic. Here you might think of humane vitae, of human life, or nostra aetate in our age. Here, in Augustine's Confessions, the opening thematic word is magnus, that is, great, because God is great, powerful, vast, intense, and complete. The power, vastness, intensity, and completeness of God, Augustine's you, are themes that run through the Confessions. God is great, and God's greatness is seen in how he saved even a wretch like Augustine. Wretch? Well, it is time for us to follow the Confessions with some notes that we historians have accessible from the outside and recount the contours of Augustine's life. Aurelius Augustinus was born in the small provincial town of Tagaste in western North Africa in 354. Tagaste was roughly along the border between Greco-Roman civilization and territory still governed by the ways of the native peoples of what today is Numidia, or what we call Numidia. For my university students, I often use the analogy that Augustine's hometown is like where I currently live, that is, in Katy. which marks the transitional border between Houstonian civilization and the broader Texan lack thereof, a kind of meeting place for cosmopolitanism and cowboyism. Growing up in Tagaste, Augustine's main language was the North African regional Latin of his time, but he surely heard some Greek, and he probably heard at least one tongue of the native peoples of North Africa. Augustine's father, Patricius, or Patrick, was a low-ranking Roman official and a lifelong pagan who lived what Augustine considered to be an immoral life. As far as we can tell, Augustine never respected his father. Patricius was baptized a Christian on his deathbed, but Augustine, then a very young man and not yet a Christian, saw it as a magical stunt. He asked, basically, how could throwing water upon a dishonorable man and mumbling empty words over him have any effect on his afterlife, if there even is an afterlife at all? Whereas Augustine wrote scornfully of his father, he wrote with the highest possible praise for his mother, Saint Monica. A devout Christian, Monica prayed for the conversion of her husband and her son unceasingly for decades. She stood by them no matter what they did, no matter how much they disappointed and even betrayed her. Augustine largely credits Monica, his mother, with his own salvation. Her feast date is always the day before Augustine's. Augustine's is August the 28th, and hers is August the 27th. Whether or not that dating alignment, with Monica coming before Augustine, was intentional historically, and it probably is, it is what Augustine himself would have insisted. Augustine showed intellectual promise from a young age. His father and some family friends, sometimes lending or just giving money to his father, put forward the funds for him to study first at the local school in Tagaste, then in the nearby town with a more prominent school known as Madauros, and finally at the great Roman North African city of Carthage, in what was basically the premier university for North Africa, we might think in modern terms. As a young student, Augustine was highly attracted to the great Latin classical author Virgil. He always had an affinity for Virgil. He disliked Greek, preferring the fanciness that is possible in his native tongue to the difficulties of learning a complicated foreign language, something that always amuses my colleagues and me who spend most of our professional time handling the writings of the Greek fathers of the church rather than Latin fathers like Augustine, is that Augustine actually writes of being forced to learn some Greek as though it were a kind of horrible torture. Augustine was inspired to study philosophy by a work of Cicero about the philosophical life that is called the Hortensius. From Augustine and other classical authors, we know that the Hortensius circulated widely for several centuries, but the text is tragically lost to history, with zero known copies having survived to this day. We may hold out hope for a manuscript discovery in a European or African monastery. Such things happen from time to time, but the Library of Alexandria having met the fate that it met, we don't know if that will ever happen, right? In any event, teenage Augustine found in Cicero's Hortensius a call to the philosopher's life, and he found in writings by Virgil and others rich textual beauty and serious intellectual reflection. The texts of the Vetus Latina, Old Latin translation of the Bible, however, Augustine found to be repulsive, since they were rendered from Greek into terribly low, sometimes almost unintelligible Latin, the Latin of uneducated commoners, really. Augustine read what he liked to read, and he tossed aside anything that seemed to him to have little to no sophistication. More broadly, as a teenager and a young adult, Augustine saw Christians as unsophisticated, rigorous in the wrong things like fasting and abstinence, eccentric and unenlightened. not doing the hard work of learning that he, as a rhetorician and philosopher, always did. Augustine lived 2 to 3 full generations after Constantine's Edict of Milan, that gentleman's agreement in 313 with Christianity being legalized. And so by Augustine's time, Catholic Christianity constituted a serious plurality across the Roman Empire, if not even a majority. Yet, the empire remained a place of considerable religio-philosophical diversity. Some persons of learning and money were, in fact, Christians, and some held to the Greco-Roman pagan heritage. They, in fact, were the traditionalists of their time. We may think of these two groups of persons with power, the Christians and the traditionalist pagans, as the most prevalent. There were, however, other subgroups within Roman society's upper class. The kinds of persons whom the young Augustine idolized participated in fashionable and sophisticated philosophical and cultic movements, rejecting both traditional Greco-Roman paganism and the recently ascended Orthodox imperial Christianity in favor of trendy spaces in which they could behave as social elitists always behave. Augustine's first major stop on his philosopher's quest was one such trendy movement called Manichaeanism. The Manichaeans held to a total dualism, that is, a hard separation between good and evil, with a good God force and a bad God force balancing all that happens in the universe. Here, if you are thinking that Manichaeanism sounds slightly similar to Southeast Asian Taoism with the yin and the yang, then you are on something like a decent mental track. As part of their dualism, the Manichaeans saw all things physical and material as evil. They did not believe that a person has any free will whatsoever, since what determines his actions is the quantity of good or evil power that he happens to have. Manichaeans rejected all things of the flesh, seeing even reproduction, the creation of new life, as participation in evil, since it involves activities of the flesh spurred by animal-like internal longings and brings about new physical beings into an inherently wicked material world. Augustine, however, was deeply engrossed in physical passions. Although we do not have specific documentation of this, it is possible that Augustine's father modeled sexual escapades for his son by living as an adulterer. In the Confessions, Augustine remembers Patricius praising him during his pubescence for being sexually charged, suggesting that Augustine's father probably encouraged him to begin having encounters with girls at a young age. And as members of, let's say, the bottom rung of Roman aristocracy, presumably slave girls, right? Beside his sexual activities, Augustine also was involved in more general debaucheries, like drinking, dancing, and attending carnivals. The Manichaeans did not believe that persons are to blame for the things that they do, but they did believe that someone manifests the relative allotment of goodness or wickedness inside him by his actions, and his actions needed to be non-sexual and otherwise non-fleshly for him to enter the group's inner circles. Augustine did not want to live with chastity and moderation, and he never was properly satisfied intellectually by the teachings of the Manichaeans, so he always was sort of trapped in their periphery. Augustine's second major serious stop on his philosopher's quest was a lot more satisfying for him, and this was Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism is the general name that we modern scholars give to the style of adherence to the teachings of Plato, the great Greek philosopher, that was most prevalent in late antiquity. especially in the Greek East, although obviously for Augustine, that was also the Latin West. The Neoplatonists held to a number of positions that Augustine found more coherent than those of the Manichaeans. In Augustine's view, one of the most important advantages in coherency of Neoplatonism over Manichaeanism was the Neoplatonic answer to the so-called problem of evil. The philosophical problem of evil can be phrased succinctly in this way. If there is a God, and God is omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and omnibenevolent, all-good, then why is there evil and suffering in the world? If God is all-powerful, then he has the capacity to end all evil and suffering. If he is all-knowing, then he has the knowledge to end all evil and suffering. If he is all-good, then he wills to end all evil and suffering. Yet God does not end all evil and suffering. For my students, I typically explain the problem of evil with a personal analogy. I have a beautiful 5-year-old daughter named after St. Lucy. Suppose that Lucy were to trip and fall in our kitchen directly in front of me, and I were to see her head hurtling toward the cement tile. As her father, I know that it is good for her to not fall and become injured. I will for her to not fall and become injured. I have the ability to stop her from falling and becoming injured. If Lucy should fall and become injured anyway, then literally what the hell is my problem? We humans have a similar view of God's treatment for us as our Heavenly Father. And this is basically what prompts our perennial questioning of the problem of evil, which has been called, among other things, the bedrock of atheism. One of the complaints that Augustine had against Christianity is that Christians professed a God with all of those attributes, omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence, but he found their explanations for the existence of evil to be philosophically weak. He couldn't find a Christian talking about the problem in a way that made sense to him. Whereas the Manichaeans attributed evil and suffering to the random allotments of good and evil inside everything that come ultimately from the balance between the grand force of good and the grand force of evil, the Neoplatonists held that evil is not, in fact, something that exists on its own, but rather the privation of good. In other words, there is not such a thing as evil. Rather, there is good, which is ultimately participation in God, who is transcendentally goodness, and there is the lack of good, which is ultimately non-existence. There is no evil entity who stands contrary to God. Things that appear evil are things that are moving away from God, but they are still participants in God's goodness. For the Catholic intellectual tradition, Genesis 1 and its absolute insistence that all of God's creation is fundamentally good has blended with this Neoplatonic teaching into one deep tradition in which we say that all that exists is fundamentally unbreakably good. Augustine himself is largely to thank for this being one of the most powerful lessons inside the introductory philosophy and theology classes at nearly every Catholic institution of higher learning today. An excellent analogy for this teaching of the Neoplatonic philosophers that Augustine found so compelling is the relationship between light and darkness, and in the Confessions, Augustine actually uses this analogy himself. Light exists, but darkness does not exist. Rather, a space is dark only when there is not any light in that space. In class, when I explain this for my students, I have the benefit of modern physics, which Augustine did not know. So what I do is I physically shut off the lights in the room, and I ask them this question. Have the photons that appeared to us a moment ago as visible light been replaced by some other thing? Or is this darkness in which we find ourselves simply the absence of those photons? For Augustine, and so too for us as modern Catholics, all that exists, inasmuch as it exists, participates in God. Nothing has no participation in God, for that would mean that it does not exist. We might think of this like a philosophical explanation for Saint Teresa of Calcutta's, Mother Teresa's, breathtaking capacity to see the face of Christ in every person. Even the most fully deranged human being alive today participates in God, and that person can be saved. Rephrased, anything that exists is godly. Since we exist, we are godly. Our wickedness is our turning away from God, not anything about us as we truly are, not anything truly human. Now, Augustine was not fully satisfied with Neoplatonism as a self-contained philosophical school. He had found a robust mental or intellectual framework inside which he could understand the truth, but he had not found the fullness of truth. Massive questions that could not be answered outside what modern people call religion remained on Augustine's mind and heart. God is one and everything exists in God, but who is he? Is he a loving God or a spiteful God? Should I worship him? And if so, why and how? How should I live my life in a way that pleases him? Now, in parallel with Augustine's intellectual journey, which occupied all of his teenage years and young adulthood, he was thriving as a professional rhetorician. This is roughly equivalent to what is in our society a successful law school graduate with some sort of prominent speaking position, like a less dishonest politician. A rhetorician was, after all, an educated public speaker on matters of state and society. Now, Augustine briefly taught rhetoric in his humble hometown of Tagaste, but he quickly secured a more profitable and prestigious teaching post in nearby Carthage. He ventured across the Mediterranean from Carthage to Rome in 383, so that's he's about 30 years old, to take up a teaching post in the mighty city. But he was quickly disillusioned with the low quality of his students and the overall lack of glamour of life relative to what he expected to find. The guy went into education. Okay. Eventually, he made it to Milan to serve as the official court orator. At that time, Milan was the de facto imperial city rather than Rome because it was where the emperor resided. Part of Augustine's assignment under the emperor might have been to go head-to-head with St. Ambrose, the bishop of Milan, another man of towering intellect and robust rhetorical skills. It might have been Ambrose who introduced Augustine to Neoplatonic philosophy. If so, Ambrose also would have been key in helping Augustine discover the truth value of Christianity. In Milan, Augustine had what can only be called a dark night of the soul. Partly with thoughts of his mother on his mind, partly under St. Ambrose's influence, and partly dissatisfied with his high courtly life and the religious temperaments and values of the shallow people with money and slaves around him. Augustine realized that his proper home was probably Christianity. He could not bring himself to request baptism, however, because that would mean that he needed to leave behind his life of financial prosperity, secular prestige, regular partying, and sex. Famously, as Augustine recounts in the Confessions, he prayed, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." As a young man, I find myself prompted to note here that Augustine's legacy as a guide for wayward young men is second to none, save perhaps the biblical books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, both of which seem to have been written specifically with the guidance of young men in mind. Augustine's inability to let go of the illusory pressures of the world has had an immediacy for young men who read his Confessions since its authorship through the Middle Ages, across the eras of the Reformations and the Renaissance, and all the way to today. This is part of why Augustine's Confessions is a universal part of the core curricula at Catholic universities throughout the world. The Confessions speak to young adults. This text speaks to young adults, especially young men, in many ways in which other great texts of the faith might not. I hazard that Augustine's "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet" is actually the prayer in the hearts of most young men as we examine our consciences in preparation for reconciliation. We crave God, but in our fallen state we crave the things other than God that God wills for us to crave in excessive and perverse ways that are contrary to how God wills for us to crave them. In Book 8 of the Confessions, Augustine recalls his extreme internal struggle between continuing life as he was living it and abandoning it all in favor of baptism, as well as the exact moment when it was resolved. Water break. To set the scene, Augustine, 33 years old, the same age as Christ was at the Passion, according to tradition, has been sitting alongside his friend named Alypius in that friend's garden in Milan. In total misery, Augustine has walked to another part of the garden on his own. He writes, "I threw myself down under a certain fig tree and let my tears flow freely. Rivers streamed from my eyes, a sacrifice acceptable to you. And though not in these words, yet in this sense, I repeatedly said to you, how long, O Lord, how long, Lord, will you be angry to the uttermost? Do not be mindful of our old iniquities. For I felt my past to have a grip on me. It uttered wretched cries. How long is it to be? Tomorrow, tomorrow. Why not now? Why not an end to my impure life in this very hour?" As I was saying this and weeping in the bitter agony of my heart, suddenly I heard a voice from a nearby house chanting, as if it might be a boy or a girl, I do not know which, saying and repeating over and over again, "Pick up and read, pick up and read." At once my countenance changed, and I began to think intently whether there might be some sort of children's game in which such a chant is used, but I could not remember having heard of one. I checked the flood of tears and stood up. I interpreted it solely as a divine command to me to open the book and read the first chapter I might find. Little skip ahead. I hurried back to the place where Alypius was sitting. There I had put down the book of the Apostle. This is St. Paul's letter to the Romans. When I got up, I seized it, opened it, and in silence read the first passage upon which my eyes lit. Not in riots and drunken parties, not in eroticisms and indecencies, not in strife and rivalry, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in its lusts. I neither wished nor needed to read further. At once, with the last words of this sentence, it was as if a light of relief from all anxiety flooded into my heart. All the shadows of doubt were dispelled. Shortly after, the childlike voice from heaven directed Augustine to read from St. Paul's epistle to the Romans. Augustine was baptized by St. Ambrose, the bishop of Milan, his one-time foe. After sorting his practical affairs in Milan, including quietly leaving his prestigious post as one of the rhetoricians of the court, and spending some time in contemplative prayer and the study of the scriptures, he moved to Hippo, back in North Africa, not far from his hometown of Tagaste. He did not intend to become a priest, but he was made one, and eventually he took the position of bishop. Basically, as somebody as educated and accomplished as he was, other bishops wanted him to be a bishop. From there, Augustine wrote most of his massive corpus of refined Christian writings that have influenced the whole of Christian history. Throughout this talk, I have pointed to many aspects of Augustine's Catholic legacy. Before I close, I would like for us to consider one specific teaching from St. Augustine in isolation, and how this teaching has informed modern Catholic life in its most basic structural rudiments, namely marriage itself. Before Augustine became a Christian, he had a longtime concubine, a common law marriage basically, a common law wife whom he simply calls Una, the one or someone. Now, with Una, Augustine had a son, whom they named, long before Augustine's conversion to Christianity, Adeodatus, which means gift from God. Augustine writes of having real love for this Una, this someone, and he writes of Adeodatus, his boy, gift from God, as his pride and joy. Curiously, though, Augustine writes of his bond with Una, the one, as fueled mainly by the sin of lust. At least that's what brought them together and kind of had him stay with her for so long. Of course, we know that all such comments from Augustine are retrospective. In late imperial Roman society, presumably, at least as we can tell from the records, even among many Christian groups, it was widely understood that a man of higher social class might have a long-term concubine or common law wife as a matter of course, at least until such a time as he might legally marry someone from his own social class, but even perhaps for the duration of both of their lives. Living sexually engaged with one partner over the long term was considered a kind of respectable middle way between living licentiously and living in chastity. Eventually, after his conversion, Augustine himself played no small role in purging this nonsense from the church, but it was the context in which he lived his own life. Shortly after Augustine's conversion, his mother, Monica, died. His partner, Una, left him, and his young teenage son, Adeodatus, died. In a span of about 2 years, then, just after he's embraced Christianity, the three most important people in Augustine's life who had been with him through it all were gone. Decades later, with that time of unthinkable personal agony in long-term memory, and having served as the pastor of thousands of souls, Augustine wrote a short treatise called De Bono Conjugali, which means on the good of marriage. In that text, Augustine outlines three tremendous goods of marriage that give marriage godly purpose. First, above all, marriage is the locus of the good of joining in God's creative activity by bringing children into the world. You know, at nuptial masses, a weird thing we do as Catholics is the priest or deacon says, "Are you open to children?" Thanks, Augustine. Second, marriage is a space of fidelity, and the practice of fidelity is objectively good for the souls of the man and the woman. Third, marriage symbolizes for the world the unity that all who are saved will have with God in heaven. The bond between man and woman in marriage is, for Augustine, the closest that we see on earth, the closest analogy to or image of the bond that all humans who are saved will have with our Creator in eternal life. On December 31st, 1930, during the octave of the Holy Family, that's a fact that's often missed but very important, His Holiness Pope Pius XI promulgated the encyclical letter Casti Connubii of chaste marriage. Some 15 centuries after Augustine wrote De Bono Conjugalis on the good of marriage, Augustine's treatise on marriage was yet again, that is, after having repeatedly been cited by Catholic thinkers for centuries upon centuries, the source text to which the Pope turned most frequently. Now, the proximate cause for Pius XI's encyclical was that the Anglican Communion had just decided to allow some contraceptives. But the real cause was much deeper. A growing division between Catholics, and everyone else around us in the Western world on what marriage really is. Augustine's timeless teaching of the three goods of marriage, bringing children into the world, so participating in God's creative activity, practicing fidelity, therefore growing in our souls closer to God, and symbolizing the union between the saved and God in heaven. Augustine's teaching of these three goods became a kind of Catholic calling card in the modern world. The number of teachings of St. Augustine that are truly Catholic, that is, universal, seems endless. One of Augustine's official titles is the Doctor of Grace, because we regard his teachings on nature and grace to be deeply authoritative. We are good by nature, Augustine taught, but as fallen beings, we are in absolute need of God's grace. Our nature and God's grace must cooperate in order for us to live righteously. Augustine is largely responsible for redirecting the church from adult baptism as the dominant practice to infant baptism as the dominant practice. Since baptism is liberation from original sin and entry into the sacramental life of the church, Augustine taught, one should be baptized as soon as it is viable. Finally, and yes, this is a dark note, but for our specific moment in time, I say Augustine's writings are definitive for our belief that a sacrament remains a true sacrament regardless of the merit of the person performing the sacrament. We all know that this teaching has taken the most extremely tragic value possible in our 21st century context, in which thousands have had to ask if their sacraments have been valid, even when performed by child molesters. Yes, we say with total confidence, as long as those sacraments were performed according to the legal minima of the church, they were and are real, and they were and are salvific, and they can and do overcome the atrocities committed by these. I could go on and on listing Augustine's Catholic legacies for another full hour at the least. But for now, I must say this. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next time in January as we dive into the life and teachings of St. Athanasius of Alexandria in St. Athanasius Against the World.